let's turn our attention to the three arguments that Rachel's offers in the chapter that purport to establish that ethical egoism isn't the correct ethical theory, that ethical egoism isn't true. The first argument that Rachel presents is what he calls the argument that ethical egoism endorses wickedness. And here's how this argument goes. So, ethical egoism, as we've seen, designates that all actions that promote self-interest are ethically good actions. Right? So it prescribes that you should always do what promotes your own self-interest. That's the ethically correct action to take. Now, many actions that promote our own self-interest that ethical egoism seems to prescribe as the ethically correct action from our intuitive perspective seem utterly wicked, ethically bad, ethically blameworthy, not ethically allowable. Right? So, for example, it's in someone's self-interest to water down cancer drugs and sell those watered down cancer drugs to cancer patients because they'll make more money that way. And so that promotes their own self-interest. But people who do that seem intuitively bad. They seem to be acting in ways that are morally blameworthy. And there seems to be ethical prohibitions against doing things like that from an intuitive level. And so in this argument, those things are characterized as wicked. All right? So from the perspective of, say, Vladimir Putin, it may well be in his own self-interest to undermine Western democracies and kill all people who oppose him within his own country. But intuitively, we see that as wicked, as evil, as ethically bad. And so this idea behind this argument is that ethical egoism seems to predict or dictate certain courses of action. It brands them as ethically praiseworthy courses of action when our intuitions are that they are, in fact, wicked or ethically blameworthy, ethically bad. And therefore, we should reject ethical egoism because the assumption of the truth of ethical egoism has implications that we intuitively view as pretty clearly false implications, like selling watered down cancer drugs is the morally correct thing to do, right? And if the truth of ethical egoism implies that those kinds of actions are ethically praiseworthy, then we should reject ethical egoism as a false view because it seems to have false implications. What does Rachel think of this argument? Well, he thinks that this is probably a pretty good argument. However, he does sort of defend it from the ethical egoist perspective. He says, look, from our perspective, these intuitions that we have seem pretty convincing. They seem pretty strong. They're pretty widely held. But the ethical egoist might say, well, look, these are just intuitions. These are just gut reactions. These are visceral emotional responses that we're having. And we're taking them as definitive of the quality or the character of those actions. And that begs the question against ethical egoism. It arbitrarily, or at least without any sort of objectively acknowledged reasons, says that the pronunciations, the predictions, the implications of ethical egoism are in fact morally blameworthy, wicked, ethically bad. And the ethical egoist says, look, that's just your intuition. That's not a reason to reject ethical egoism. That just assumes ethical egoism is false. And so that's Rachel's defense of ethical egoism against this argument, even though he himself thinks that it's a pretty good argument. What about the next argument? Well, the next argument that Rachel considers is what he calls the argument that ethical egoism is logically inconsistent. Now, this is a slightly complicated argument. It's probably the most complex argument we've looked at so far, so we'll go through it sort of carefully. Now, first premise. Suppose that it's each person's duty to do that which promotes their own self-interest. Right? Now, imagine two individuals. They're running in an election. Call one D, call one R. From D's perspective, it's in D's best interest to kill R, because killing R will result in D winning the election. Okay? So it seems like, given our first assumption, given the implicit assumption of ethical egoism, that D has a moral duty. It's the correct action for D to take to kill R, because that will result in the promotion of D's self-interest that will allow D to win the election. Now let's look over at R. It's in R's self-interest. It promotes R's self-interest to prevent D from killing her. So R seems to be morally obligated to prevent D from killing her, according to this first assumption, that implicit assumption of ethical egoism. So what have we got so far? D's duty on this assumption is to kill R. R's duty on this assumption is to prevent D from killing them. So we've got two implications of that assumption of ethical egoism here in this situation. Now, it's always wrong, says this argument, to prevent someone from doing their duty. So it's always wrong to prevent people from acting in accordance with their ethically correct, prescribed duties. Therefore, it's wrong for R to prevent D from killing her. D has a moral obligation to kill R because it promotes her self-interest. Therefore, it's wrong for R to prevent D from killing her because it's wrong for R to prevent D from doing their duty from an ethical perspective. Therefore, this argument says, it's both wrong and not wrong for R to prevent D from killing her. For an act to be both wrong and not wrong is a contradiction. That's not possible. It's inconsistent. And therefore, that initial assumption that we started off with, that each person's duty to do what's in their own best interest, right, that assumption needs to be rejected. It can't be true because its implications, it results in this contradiction, this thing that can't possibly be true. So if we assume 1, we end up with 8, that contradiction that is both wrong and not wrong for R to prevent D from killing her, and therefore we should reject that initial assumption so that we don't end up with this clearly false consequence of that assumption. So what's Rachel's evaluation of this argument? Well, Rachel is sympathetic to this argument. However, he says that this argument actually needs this extra assumption to establish or to show that ethical egoism results in the seeming contradiction that we find on line 8. And that assumption is on line 5. That assumption is that it's wrong to prevent someone from doing their duty. And as Rachel points out, right, this seems plausible enough as an assumption, but it's not actually consistent with ethical egoism. Ethical egoism will qualify this at the very least to say that it's wrong to prevent someone from doing their duty if that undermines your own self-interest. It's not going to be the case that we have these dictates that don't follow from the promotion of one's self-interest. And so in this way, Rachel suggests this argument begs the question. It makes assumptions that an ethical egoist wouldn't accept because they don't seem clearly consistent with ethical egoism. And without that assumption, you can't derive that seemingly false implication that we find in line 8, that contradiction, that R is both wrong and not wrong in acting to prevent D from killing her. And so this argument on Rachel's conception fails to establish that ethical egoism is an incorrect or false doctrine.